get Prince, the singer, and how he had just purple everywhere and left us with the phrase purple rain. Never really I don't think I've ever seen purple rain. I think I ever see the rain purple. But in 1958, for all you who are old, 1958, the singer, songwriter, and actor Sheb Wooley put out a strange song about aliens. And he talked about one-eyed, one-horned, flying purple people eaters. And I don't think anybody ever understood exactly what he was talking about, except maybe the Minnesota Vikings, who a decade or so later had their fearsome foursome named the Purple People Eaters as their defense. So it's been an intriguing time in the world for this unique color. I look out there today, and I don't see anybody wearing purple. Am I wrong?
No, yep. Got it right here.
You got a little purple.
Yep.
Okay? Did you know that thousands of years ago, only the rich and powerful were allowed to wear purple? That in Roman times it was actually the law. And that only royalty or very rich people could wear the color purple. It was outlawed, which makes it interesting. But then it became very popular. A garment that had or was purple, because it was such expensive material. So then everybody, when you say you can't have something, that's when what? Everybody wants it. And that's everybody wanted it. So I want to talk today only about 5 scriptures that take place in the Bible. And it's about a woman. And she was not only known as the Purple Lady, but I tend to think of her as the Purple Leader, because she was definitely a leader in the church as we continue our series on success and leadership. And I see that example of Lydia. Lydia shows up in the scriptures in Acts chapter 16, starting about verse 11, 12. But why should we really care about Lydia? What do we know about her? Well, you read the few scriptures there. She was from Thyatira. She was living in Philippi. And why was she in Philippi? Well, we're going to look into that today. Because like us, she may have been born in one place and lived in another. We do know she had a home there. But one of the things it brings out was that she worshiped God, which was unique in the city of Philippi. And she was willing to be a businesswoman, be a woman who stood out from the rest. She was not intimidated by society. She was passionate about her belief. And so she sets an incredible example for all of us. I'd like you to turn there, if you will. I'll be reading from the New King James Version. Chapter 16 of Acts. Chapter 16 of Acts. We'll go to verse 12. And from there to Philippi, which is the foremost or first city of that part of Macedonia, a colony, we were staying in that city for some days. Who's writing this? Anybody know? Luke. Excellent. So Luke was traveling with Paul. So we have a first-hand account of someone who was there. It isn't like, and I heard from this and I heard from that. We have first-hand account. Okay? Now let's go down to verse 13. On the Sabbath day, we went out of the city to the riverside, where prayer was customarily made. And we sat down and spoke to the women who met there. Interesting place here. There were actually two rivers that flowed kind of through Philippi. One of them was the main one. And a lot of people read that and say, well, wait a minute, why weren't they in the temple? Well, there wasn't any temple, as it says. This was a Gentile area, Gentile region of Philippi. And if there were not 10 Jewish families in a city, you could not have a synagogue. So here were some women. How they found out about God, I don't know. But they had come to worship on the Sabbath day out by the river. And the Greek word is interesting there, as it says, where prayer was customarily made. The meaning in the Greek was prosika. Prosika. Prosika, we would think of maybe as a courtyard. It was a meeting area where there were benches. You might have seen that here. We have parks. We have parks you can go to, and there may be the water there, and there's areas to sit. There's like tables to eat. There's various things like this. There's no roof. There's trees, but there's no real roof. Well, that's what this prosika was picturing here. So we have an area where we have women gathered in this little area, prosika. And it's a place for reflection. It's a place for prayer. It's a place to gather and meet. But they're meeting there on the Sabbath day for good reason. Saturday was not the typical day of worship in a Gentile city. And we're going to look at the city of Philippi, also the the city of that she was originally from. I want to look at this from a different perspective, maybe, because she is a very impressive woman. And it says there, as we'll go down to verse 14, now a certain woman named Lydia heard us. Heard us. She was a seller of purple from the city of Thyatira, who worshiped God, which made her different. Thyatira from Philippi was about 240 miles, about the distance from Miami to Orlando. If you've ever driven that. And so she was pretty far away from her home, or where she was born. And it says in verse 14, the Lord opened her heart. So obviously she was what? Had questions, was searching. And God had called her out of this world, as He has done so many of His followers. The Lord opened her heart to heed the things spoken by Paul. What do you think Paul spoke about on the Sabbath? God. I think it's pretty fair to say. This is what, if you read Paul's letters, you read Paul anything, Paul's all about God's work and what Christ had done and died and came to deliver. In verse 15, and when she and her household were baptized, she begged us, saying, "If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay." And she constrained us, or she really pushed us. She wanted us there. Why did she want them there? She wanted to hear more. She was hungering and thirsting, as so many that God calls as He looks upon the heart. That's why He calls various people. So let's look at this certain points in these scriptures. There's 4 or 5 of them here. And I first want to look because it says she's from Thyatira. Thyatira. Okay, what was Thyatira? Well, it was a city. It's now in Turkey. Originally, it was in Greece. Like I say, it was 240 miles away. So what does that have to do with this? It's interesting if you go and study the city that was Thyatira. Is now named Akhisar in Turkey. Today the population is about 15 to 20,000 people. And it's known for basically one thing. It's not a major city. It wasn't really known for a lot back in biblical times except for one thing. Thyatira was a manufacturing area. They had, as we would call them, factories set up. They had certain skills that the city of Thyatira had for hundreds and hundreds of years, if not now, thousands of years. You can go there now to Thyatira and buy certain cloth, certain clothes that are made there, as they are following their predecessors from all that time as they're known. Now, what's interesting is they didn't manufacture but just a few things, and that was clothes. Clothes to wear, different types of cloth. It's interesting because you can find this out through history. You don't need me to tell you, but it just makes up for the story of how Lydia was there. Was Thyatira at her time was known as the city of purple. They made cloth of different type, but they were known for making cloth of purple. Interesting part was that they had this certain Tyrian dye that only came from that area. Only came from city of Tyre and Sidon, as you know, was Phoenician, which is interesting because it was 1,500 miles away. And so the people of Tyre found that this shellfish that they had on their shore, and plenty of it that would wash up, had this membrane-type material or fiber in it, and when it was washed ashore, it would come out and it would just be like, kind of like you look at jellyfish now, right? You see a jellyfish that washes up, okay, and it's just kind of clear. Well, that's what this kind of membrane was out of the shellfish, Murex shellfish to be exact. But when it is pressed or compressed, it turns to purple. Turns this incredible color of purple, this very dark, deep purple. And they said one theory was it was actually found by some royalty as a dog was walking on the beach and then grabbed one and his mouth came back and his mouth was all purple. Don't know if that's correct, but that's what they say. But that's how they found out about it. Well, Tyre wasn't known. It was a shipping area, and that's what that's what the Phoenicians were known for. So they started making a few pieces of cloth. and they really didn't have the skill, and there really wasn't the desire there for that, to make these pieces of fabric to wear that was purple. So, being the shipping greats that they were, and they ran their ships all everywhere, they then found they could put this purple dye from the shellfish into containers and ship it to the area known as Thyatira, who was known to be making all types of cloth. Thyatira had buildings after building after building set aside for manufacturing cloth. And they had, we would call them unions, they called them guilds. Like the Screen Actors Guild, it's where you belong to a certain group. They had multiple guilds in the city of Thyatira. It was everything in this city. And they became more popular because they started having this dye brought into them. And they started then, they were the major manufacturer of purple clothes, which became so big, so popular, that that is how the city received most of their income. The dye, this purple Tyrrhenian dye, a pound of this, or a pound of pre-dyed wool, would set people back an incredible amount of money. That pretty soon these containers of this dye, a pound of it, which was about that big, was worth as much or more than gold. A pound was worth in today's dollar about 25,000 US dollars. So the shipping started coming into them as they were buying this. Now, the beautiful part about it was when they made all this stuff, they had to sell it. They were known for it, but you also had to be able to distribute it. If you ever run a factory, you can make all the cars you want, but unless there's somewhere to distribute them and get them out, they're just going to sit on your lot. But the thing about this Tyrrhenian dye that they made these clothes out of is they were known because in Thyatira they would baptizo twice the clothes. It's where we get the word baptize. It means to immerse. So they would dip this cloth in this purple dye and then pull it out, let it dry, because they had all the facilities there to let it dry. Then they would do it again. So it was fully covered in this purple Tyrrhenian dye. Now, you say, well, that's nice, but what's it got to do with God? Okay? The part is now some of that same material has been kept thousands of years. And one of the reasons why they have been able to keep it, they found that this dye preserves the cloth when it is dipped twice. And that for some reason, and they don't know why, it didn't fade hardly any after years and years of being exposed even to the sun, which is very rare. Ultraviolet rays usually break things down. So they found that these clothes that were made and so were kept for 200 to 300 years and handed down from one generation to the other. They even went so far as to they found a root called madder root. It's a type of plant. At the base of this root, you could compress this root and you found it would come out purple. almost as good as this shellfish. But it didn't hold up, and it became known as the fake purple. As people were, you find something that works, you get a knockoff. So even 2,000 years ago, they had knockoffs. Okay? You think you got a Rolex watch, somebody on the street in New York says they got a Rolex for $100. Guess what? It's a knockoff. Okay? Well, here you had the cloth. So, the interesting part about Thyatira was it was also a very Gentile and pagan city. So much so that there was a temple in the main part of the city that took up, we would say, 2 or 3 blocks. Take double the size of this building here. Not quite as tall, but take out the spread. That was their central part of worship. That was the central part of the city. And so what was interesting, this temple at Thyatira was dedicated to Sambeth. S-A-M-B-E-T-H-E. Sambeth was a prophetess, a goddess who worked with Apollo. And so at this Sambeth, what does it sound like? Sabbath? When you heard it in Greek, the words almost were the same. Sabbath. But people would come and worship at this temple. And you found that because this was a goddess, supposedly, who spoke for Apollo, the women who worked in the temple, they were prophetesses. And one would come out every day out of this temple and would speak to the masses, because this is what the god was saying. So they were saying that this god, Apollo, talked to Sambeth, and Sambeth told them this prophetess, this woman, who would come out and lead everybody in religion, lead the worship. And this was Thyatira, and it was well accepted. And it was believed that Thyatira was so blessed financially because they had what? This temple. And she was blessing them. Now, it was interesting because they said the whole city, the entire city, listened. The entire city bought into this. Now, what's interesting, this place or this temple was called the Castle of Thyra. Thyra had another name of Semiramis. So, any of you know who Semiramis or Semiramis was referred to? You realize it's a pagan, goes back to the pagan worship. Now, I bring this up because later on, from the time that we see Acts 16, which happened in the early 50 ACE, we find by later on, a decade or so later, there was a church in Thyatira. John addresses this in the book of Revelation, remember? So there, where this was all a pagan city, guess what? In Thyatira now, there is actually a church of God. Let's go back there just quickly, because it doesn't say that much about it. In Revelation 2? Revelation 2. Revelation 2, verse 18, talks about to the angel of the church of Thyatira. And in verse 19 says, I know your works, love, service, faith, and your patience. As for your works, the last was more than the first. Okay? They didn't start out as well. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you, because you allow that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, to teach and beguile my servants to commit sexual immorality and to eat things sacrificed to idols. We'll go into it, but you can see this Jezebel is now referenced, because Jezebel was what? A symbol of religion led by the apostasy. One that definitely doesn't follow God. And so this woman is being referenced as Jezebel. Why is she referenced Jezebel? You remember Jezebel? Jezebel was married to King Ahab, right? Jezebel came into Israel, married into Israel. She was from where? She was Phoenician. And she came in and married, and she just decided she would just change the religion of Israel. So she said, well, hey, here's how we're going to do it. I'm going to have 2 temples set up. One's in Samaria. And I'm going to have 450 prophets of Baal set up there. And then I'm going to come down and I'm going to set up another one. And in Jezreel. And I'm going to set up 400 prophets of Ashtoreth there. And so just one woman, Jezebel, was able to change how the whole nation of Israel worshipped after it was promised to God to worship. So you can see how even in the letters to the churches that's in Revelation, Thyatira is still being dominated by false religion. And the prophetess, this God, this woman, God per se, is still dominating the scene. And it's even affecting the church. Even though there's a church set up there, guess what? Sexual immorality is just allowed. That's part of the worship. Well, you can't say members aren't affected by all these things. And so I find it interesting that Lydia was from Thyatira, a very pagan city. And she moved from Thyatira over to Philippi, 240 miles away. Now, obviously, because it says she was known for the seller of purple, was she go-between? Was she a businesswoman that set up businesses and brought the cloth from Thyatira to Philippi? Oh no, we do know that she was known as a pretty good businesswoman. And the tie to Philippi, as I get into, because she was living there. I find it interesting because all the experts, all the historic writers, bring in that Philippi was known as Rome's favorite city. It was part of the Roman Empire. It was in Greece. Philippi, named after Alexander the Great's father, Philip. It was in Macedonia. But the thing that's most known about Philippi was that it was situated. After the Romans took over, of course, they wanted their armies to be able to move, so what did they do? They miraculously came up with concrete. They were the inventors of concrete. And so they were able to pave roads. Never been done before. Pave roads with concrete. And so all of a sudden, trade started just picking up because people could travel. You didn't have to wait until the weather got good. You could take your wagons across. You could do all this stuff. But all roads led to Philippi. It was a road called Ignatian Way. And the thing was, when you entered Philippi, it was known as the gate because the roads led in and led out. But the thing that you came to when you entered the city was this incredible, took up like from here all the way to the road, as far as you could see, markets. It was a marketing place. Everything that could be sold, everything that could be bought was brought into the city of Philippi. An incredible business as people were bringing stuff in. Anything you wanted from the west to the east was all brought into Philippi, as you would see a market. You may have seen them. We've seen, we have here, we have our little flea markets, or we have this, but this would dwarf any of that. It was just so huge. So can you see how, if she came from Thyatira and knew about the cloth, how she would be a go-between between bringing the Tyrrhenian dye in, getting it to Thyatira, having guilds or whole businesses set up, and then she would be able to see that the cloth is brought into Philippi so that they could go all across the world. It is the most desired cloth in the entire world, and she was kind of the head of that. Now, what made Philippi so special? It's the only city in all of Rome, and Rome controlled Roman Empire, that there was no tax on the people, products, or anything. No tax. So you could see how everybody wanted to do business there. You didn't have to pay anybody anything. Yeah, just market went crazy like that. But it's interesting because Philippi also had a seat of judgment right there in the marketplace. And they also had a jail right in the marketplace. So if they caught you doing anything, guess what? We'll just take you right here. We have a seat of judgment. And the bad thing about their seat of judgment isn't if you were found, you picked something up from this market, or you stole, or you were found guilty of these things. They put you in there, but yes, William, you are right. Their penalty for stealing was your first hand. And then your second hand, if you're caught again. And this was something that's a seat of judgment. Yes, we saw you steal. Put your hand there. Chop it off. Okay? And they were known to have doctors there who then covered it up and kept you from bleeding to death. They wanted you to continue to do business. But this was a sign. And so many people, it was known that if you were a business person and you were older, you would put your hand in your pocket. Because when you were younger, there wasn't a hand there. And if people didn't saw you missing without a hand, they weren't about to do business with you. So as you can see, this is a story, it is a tale, but it tells us something about this incredible woman, Lydia, and this city in which she lived in. So we see Thyatira, we see Philippi, and we know that she's an important person in Philippi. And her ties to Thyatira shows also she was probably a pretty good businesswoman. So let's look at, with the little time I have left here, let's look at the woman. Let's look at the woman. And see why this is such an amazing story. Let's go back to Acts 16. Acts 16, verse 13. On the Sabbath day, we went out of the city. So you see this, the city was all this courtyard buying and selling. Okay, I mean the marketplace is crazy. William, you might have traveled there. Turkish Bazaar. Have you seen where, you go to one of these cities and it's just people crazy. Even people in Zanzibar. Yes. Where it's just thousands of people. It's just, they're selling everything. There's animals here. There's meat that they're selling and all this kind of stuff. It's just everything is there. So this is all going on when? God's Sabbath day. So it makes sense, if you're not doing business on the Sabbath, you're not going to be what? You're not going to be in the city. Because that's where everything's going on. So Paul needed to get away. And so he went out to this rest area. And he finds, as it says, he's talking, obviously. As it says, where prayer was customarily made, and we sat down and spoke to the women who met there. So why is this unique? Well, wait a minute. What about today? Today, the Sabbath is typically a very busy day for everybody except us. Those who, believe what God's Word says, and we don't work. So it's unique to find on the busiest day of the year people who are gathered at this place looking at the river. Where was Paul going to go? He's not going to be in the city, is he? So he comes out there and he has to wonder, what are these women doing out here? And so he starts a conversation. And then he finds that they're doing some prayer. And so let's go back, look at the scripture now. Now a certain woman named Lydia heard us talking, obviously. Talking about God, because isn't that typically what most of us do? Hopefully on the Sabbath, is we bring up things about God. We talk about God. We talk about what He's done for us. We talk about the work. He gets us through there another time. She was a seller of purple from the city of Thyatira who worshiped God, which is definitely an anomaly. She's from Thyatira, a very pagan city, and she's in there, and she's right in the middle of all this business going on, and she's come here on the Sabbath. Just incredibly unique. And it said she worshiped God. Who worshiped God. The Lord opened her heart. See, that's what it's all about. You're not here because you're smarter than anyone else. You're not here even because some family member might have given you a piece of literature or started you thinking. No. You're here because God opened your heart. You see, because He searches, just like David. Why did He make David the king? It wasn't because he's smarter than everybody else. He was a man after God's own heart. So there's a little something in your heart that you may never understand until Jesus Christ tells you yourself why I called you. But here, He knew there was something about Lydia. He wanted this woman who would be the first Christian convert in the entire area of Macedonia, of Europe, future Europe, and all of Asia. The very first one. And it was a woman. Now, for a woman doing business at that time was unique. She had to be what? Sharper than everyone else. She had to be tough. She had to be a businesswoman. She had to have all this because men typically control most of the things. But not with this woman. You think of Proverbs 31 woman? Buy and sell. I mean, God was looking for a woman like this. He was looking for what? A leader. And He had the entire city of Philippi, which was a big-sized city. Big city. And He chose the one closest to Him because of her heart. He didn't choose a man. He chose a woman. He chose the best person at that time. And it wasn't a man. Is that empowering? It should be. Empowering to every woman in here. Also should be a little humbling to us men. So here Paul and Luke had to go, wow, look at this. Look at this. And it said then, He opened her heart to heed the things spoken by Paul. She was listening to Paul. And that's interesting, just those words there. She heeded, listened to Paul. Because I'm sure she had hundreds, if not hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men in her past that tell her what to do. And she basically had to do things herself. But here, when she heard that they were the words of God, what did she do? She listened. She listened. So it didn't matter who brought it. It was about, she knew God was relating this to her. Now think about this. She is probably, as all the historical books says, this is really, really rare for a woman in Philippi. Now imagine you had a business and you are the only woman in all of Miami to run a business, and yours was doing really, really well. And you had a product everybody desired. And so they came from all around the world to get your product, and what happens? No, I'm closed. It's Saturday. Imagine that today. Would you stand out? Now, in Miami, there's businesses that do this, but, I mean, think about it. Would you stand out? Back then, if you were one of the few women did it, you definitely would stand out. She was willing to make a stand for her God. What an example to all of us. Running a business for all the years that I did, and the company closing on Saturday shuts you out from 17.5% of your business. You know what most companies want to end with? About 10 to 12% profit. That's what you're happy with. You're willing to close the door. You're willing to obey God and let Him take care of the financial end. That's what you're saying here. We've had people lose jobs. We have people here who didn't take jobs because, if you could just work just a few hours. Why? Because you believe what God says. That He's your banker. He's your real estate person. He's your one that's going to take care of you. And that's what you have to. And this is what she believed 2,000 years ago, except she had to stand out in front of everybody. She had to stand out because of the Sabbath, and she stood out because she was a woman. That is a leader. I look forward to meeting her in the kingdom because I think she's going to be very, very impressive. So let's go. Finish this. And when she and her household were baptized, that says a lot right there, doesn't it? When she and her household was baptized. Does this remind you of another story of an incredible man? Anybody? Cornelius. Hey, good. You remember Cornelius? Peter got this call that you need to go see this man. They came and got him. And he was a centurion and went to his house. He was the first Gentile. And when he got there, it's like, it wasn't Cornelius, it was his whole household. What had his household seen? What had these women, because it's all women, what had these women seen from Lydia? That when Paul came in, every one of them was baptized. That is a leader. That is an incredible leader. And Luke wanted to make sure, guess what? He wrote about Cornelius, except he wasn't there. But he was here. And Luke saw this incredible woman, Lydia, and wanted to make sure it got down, even if it's only 5 verses. And she, her household baptized, she begged us, saying, if, isn't that a big if? If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord. Why did she say that? Anybody think about that? If you, she asked that question, if you have. Because she had to look in this entire city. And where she came from, in all of Europe, there wasn't any. And so she, if you've judged me to be that person, because Paul had never seen anyone like this. God had never opened the door to the entire world yet. It was just in the West. It was Rome. It was Israel. It was all these things. He hadn't gone there yet. And this was showing that he was ready to take the gospel to the entire world. And he was willing and ready to start with a woman. Now you go back and you read in the book of Acts where he wanted to go to this place, but God held him back and didn't let him open the way. But now he opened the door. Is it because God was waiting for the person? The right person that could set the example? And he had to wait. He couldn't wait on the men any longer. So he said, let me have a woman. Because it's a matter of the heart. Yes, Bruce, it sure is. If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. Which, this was not done. This was done by women with not really good morals, inviting men to come stay in their house, right? Especially in a Gentile society where it was kind of accepted. If you go and spend a night in somebody's house, guess what? That's what everybody expects. Did she care? No. No. She was willing to open her house because she wanted to hear the Word of God. She wanted to hear. And from all indications, the rest of chapter 16, that's where they stayed and they worked out as they went into Philippi preaching God's Word. And they had a young girl that followed them around that was a fortune teller for these people. And she did this, and Paul cast out the demon that was in her. And then they do what? They go and, oh man, this guy, she's lost her ability to tell the future. We lost all his money. Lock him up. So you remember that jail that's right there in Philippi? They go lock him up. A little beating first, right? That just kind of passed on, but it was a pretty good beating because the jailer had to take care of their beatings, usually 39 lashes with a cane stick, which opened up their back, bleeding like no tomorrow. So this was all in Philippi, which made you wonder, okay, here, what were Lydia and them doing? Think they weren't praying for him? This was the one who baptized him. This is the one. So here you see the prayer, and what happens in chapter 16. Verse 25, but at midnight Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God after getting beat half to death. Any of us have done that? I'm usually licking my wounds over there going, why me, God? And they're singing praises and hymns in this thing. And the prisoners were listening to him. Had to think, wow, who are these? Suddenly there was a great earthquake, so the foundations of the prison were shaken. Immediately all the doors were opened, and everyone's chains were loosed. And the keeper of the prison awakening from sleep, he should have been awake already, right? And seeing the prison doors open, supposing the prisoners had fled, drew his sword and was about to kill himself. He wanted to kill himself because if they were going to kill him, they were going to take their time because you fell asleep on your watch. And so he's like, huh? But Paul called with a loud voice to him, do yourself no harm, for we are all here. Then he called for a light and ran in and fell down trembling before Paul and Silas. Why didn't they run? Sir, what must I do to be saved? Was that a strange one? Not if he had been hurting them, not if he heard them singing. Not if he had, what had that, the other prisoners heard, what did that jailer hear? These men were not like any men he had ever heard before. And he knew they were from God. He said, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved, you and your household. Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house. And he took them the same hour of the night and washed their stripes. And immediately he and all of his family were baptized. Now when the house had brought them to his house, he set food before them, and he rejoiced and believed in God with all his household. The next day they find out what? These are Roman citizens. You can't beat Roman. You can't do this to Roma. You can't just arrest. They have to, Roman citizens were set aside. You have to have a trial. And you have to have so many witnesses. And they took these Roman citizens in. Yeah, you got to remember, most of these are Greek. Okay, because you're in Philippi, so you're Gentiles, and a lot of them were Greek. And you remember who conquered the Greeks were the Romans. Okay, and again, I had this. So the Romans were up here, and all of a sudden, they did this something wrong. And this was a city that, what would you say earlier? That Rome loved. This was a city, oh boy, no taxes here. We'll give you this. We'll give you protection. We're doing this. All of a sudden, these main people did something wrong. Ooh, boy. And they were scared. And they said, no, we're not leaving. Oh, please. No, we're not leaving. So, can you see then the impact that was done in this city of Philippi? All over the short period of time. And so, we go to then, that's verse 38. And the officers told these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Romans. Then they came and pleaded with them and brought them out and asked them to depart from the city. One of the commentaries says, we'll give you anything you want. Please, don't turn this place upside down. Because they could. Because they were Roman citizens. All they had to do was, there were Roman guards at every city. There was a platoon of guards. And they only answered to the emperor. They only answered to their boss. They didn't answer to any magistrates. Here, they were afraid, what if Paul and them go there? We're going to lose all of our jobs. And then the people will come down on us. And you know what happened back then? They just take the people out and stone them and kill them. If you were corrupt, if you were a corrupt official, wouldn't that be? Well, I shouldn't say that about America. You know, but there's something to that. You know? Wow. You know, you kind of see your people here. Okay? So let's finish it. And they came pleading and they wouldn't go out. And verse 40. So they went out of the prison and entered, what? The house of Lydia. Where, obviously, because we know from the book of Acts that so many of the churches, just like Rome, just like Corinth, had house churches. Because it was against the law. Roman law said you could not have a group of people come together larger than 25. Because then it became illegal. It's how they kept people from having insurrections. So all the churches, when you read, Paul would write a letter and say to all the churches in this city. Because it was known that Rome had 10 or 12 churches. Corinth had 8 or 9 churches. And so any letter was given from church to church. So all the churches started in a house. And so here we have the first house, the first church in Philippi at Lydia's house, because they went to the house of Lydia, and when they had seen the brethren, they encouraged them and departed. The church started in Philippi with one woman, one household, and one city. Remember think about that next Sabbath. You had Lydia, and here these group of women having church in their house. And all of a sudden she is joined by what? The jailer and his entire family. Turn with me to Philippians 1. Philippians 1. Just read a couple of verses here. Philippians 1. It's so inspiring. Philippians 1, and here it says, Paul and Timothy, servants of Jesus, to all the saints who are in Philippi with the bishops and deacons. This is written in about 60. This is about 7 years later. All of a sudden, that church is no longer a house church. You have deacons and elders in this church. So it's become a good-sized church. Okay? Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. I thank my God upon every remembrance of you. I remember that prison when they laid those stripes on me. But he remembers them, and he says, always in every prayer of mine making requests for all you with joy, for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now. When was that first day? We just read it. Paul remembered. And God had worked that with him. God is calling leaders. He was in 53 ACE to 60 ACE. And today, 1960 years later, He is calling leaders. Those who have a heart to follow God and live that way. So the lesson for today, like Lydia, we too must answer the call to be one of God's leaders.